The musician Emil Kahn died in 1985 at the age of 89. He was born in 1896. And he died in New York. And I'm going to talk about Emil, my uncle Emil, only at the beginning of his life, the first 40 years. Emil, the career in Germany, his life and his career and his military service in Germany. And I will stop talking about him once he has reached the shores of America as a refugee in 1935. All right. Now, Emil was born in Frankfurt. In the house in Frankfurt, a prosperous house, in the west end of Frankfurt. And he showed his musical talent from the very beginning. At the first, hardly had he emerged that he became a musician. He never wanted to be anything other than a musician. He improvised on the piano before he could say boo. Oh, that reminds me, he was called Booby until he was about 15. And Booby is what Germans call very small children, small boys, Booby. They called him Booby. And he was the youngest. The age difference between him and his brother was 5 years. So he was young. And the difference between my mother, 6 years. So he was younger. And anyhow, he was musical. He was Mr. Music. All he cared for all his life was music. And he started improvising on the piano. But until late, quite late in his life, in his 20s, he was going to be a composer. He composed. He was a composer. He composed. At his father's 50th birthday in 1907, he composed an ode to his father or something. And the Kahns, whenever they saw any talent of any kind, they promoted it. They got him a tutor, a teacher for composing. Now one would have thought it was very rare. Did Beethoven have a tutor to teach him how to compose? No, but Emil Kahn did. And he composed. He also learned to play the cello. And he must have been quite a good cellist. I asked him, how good were you on the cello? And he said, C+. But I think that was just a spasm of modesty. I think he was probably better than that. In 1915, at the age of 19, at 1915, second year of the war, he joined up. He joined up to fight for the Kaiser. But he didn't fight for the Kaiser. He played the cello for the Kaiser. He found himself in a regiment under a commanding officer who was music-loving. He loved music more than he loved the fatherland. He loved the music, and he loved especially string music, string playing. And he formed a string quartet to play for his pleasure and to play for the troops behind the lines. And they were not in the north of France where there was heavy fighting, but they were stationed Emil got himself stationed in Alsace, in a place called, I looked it up, called Firenze, so it was Florence, Firenze, near the Swiss border, at the very south of, near the Rhine. South of, there was no fighting, but there was music. And the commanding officer, music. Now, this is hard to believe, but Emil told me. He was so fond of music and so interested in furthering the career of his soldiers that he allowed Emil to take a conducting course, not composing, conducting course in Frankfurt at the conservatory. How this was done, how he got to Frankfurt and back to the, who knows. But he anyhow started to conduct. But one friend of his, one fellow musician who played the viola in the string quartet for that commanding officer, was Paul Hindemith, the real composer. And I went to the library and I looked up Hindemith's biography to check up whether it is true. Yes. He mentions a string quartet which he played while in military service in 1917 or 18. And then I read, I don't think that Emil told me that, but I read, maybe in the Hindemith book, that in 1917 they played the Debussy string quartet. There's only one. They played the Debussy string quartet, of which the commanding officer was particularly proud and pleased. He loved that quartet. And while they rehearsed it, while they played it, they got the news. Somehow, they got the news, there was no radio, that Debussy had died in Paris. This was wartime, the German war against the French. They were occupying France. And they were so upset that Debussy had died at the time when they played the Debussy quartet. It is a terrible story. And very soon afterwards, this music-loving commanding officer was transferred to the fighting in Flanders or somewhere in the north and killed. Terrible story. In 1918, Emil got married. Emil got married to Nelly Budke. Nelly Budke, whom he had known since they were children. The parents were friends. Old Budke, Siegfried Budke, the father, Nelly's father, was a professor of economics at the University of Frankfurt. They lived opposite us. I remember him. The father, Siegfried Budke, this is, by the way, died a natural death in the 30s. The mother, Nelly's mother, was deported to Theresienstadt. There was Nelly in 1918. She must have been delightful. She was an early hippie. She was totally bohemian. She did everything. She painted. Emil said she had a very good voice, good singer. She was charming and good-looking and lively. My mother loved her. She was lovely, and she had some extraordinary qualities, which are hard to believe. She had a psychic ability, a psychic sense. She had, coincidences were always, she had ESP, all kinds of stories about her, very superstitious. She was very superstitious. It's very important. Anyhow, they must have been very happy. And hardly had they got married, it was still wartime, 1918, wartime. Emil managed to get her to the Alsace. She became a camp follower. He got Nelly, his bride, to do farm work for a farmer near that musical battalion, or whatever it was, near the Swiss border in the south of France, and not south of France, in the south, well, it's the south of France, sort of. And there was Nelly. In November 9th, 1918, the war was over. November 9th, the Kaiser gave up. The Kaiser gave up. And Emil knew this. Emil said he knew 2 months ahead. They always expected him to lose the war. I mean, not always. 2 months earlier, they had already knew the war was lost. But, November 10th is Emil's birthday. So he remembers his birthday in November 10th, 1918. And so he said, the war's over, I'm going to give up. So he didn't wait for any permission. And then and they rationalized this because his oath, the oath was to the Kaiser. The oath was not to Germany, or not to the army, or the government, or anything foolish like that. The oath was to the Kaiser. Since the Kaiser had given up, Emil said, well, why should I stay? So he took his bride from the barn where he had parked her, among the farmer, and they somehow had to get across the Rhine. They managed to get around to Freiburg, and they took a train, slightly overcrowded. They took a train home to Frankfurt to mother, and father had died the year before, 1917. My father, who had served as an officer in the German army, had arrived or was about to arrive around the same time, but he had proper permission. He did not approve of this bohemian way of just deciding on your own that you give up and you go home to mother. My father had, I think, so Emil said, frowned heavily at taking matters into his own hand the way Emil did. So he went home to mother, to the Niedenau in Frankfurt, and then he did not continue his studies right away. That's very interesting. He got a job at an orchestra in Schwerin, which is the very north of Germany, not as a cellist, and he was not yet a trained conductor, but he knew something about conducting, but as a coach. And for 2 years with his young bride, he went, I think it was 2 years, to Schwerin, and then from there to Leipzig to study properly. In Leipzig, Hans was born in 1920. How is that possible? Hans was born. Maybe I've got the dates slightly wrong. But he was in Schwerin, but I know that Hans was born in 1920, and he was born in Leipzig. In Leipzig, Emil had a proper training. And then there was a series of jobs, and right through the 20s, he and Nellie were happy. They had 4 children. And Emil had a number of jobs, and his final job in Germany was in Stuttgart. And he had a contract, not with Radio Stuttgart, although he became the musical director of Radio Stuttgart, but his contract was with the Philharmonic Orchestra. And this is important. Because when things got rough, when the Nazis came, he did not have to be fired from the radio station, but the authority of the government, of the new government, was over this radio station, not so much as the Philharmonic. But I first have to tell you something else. In 1927, Wolf was born. And it's hard to know whether by then the marriage had gone bad. Probably it did. But in any case, Nellie became interested in anthropology. Well, no, it's wrong. Anthroposophy. Rudolf Steiner. Some of you know who that was. You may know about Rudolf Steiner's schools. But the I can never pronounce it properly. Anyhow, Rudolf Steiner, which is a very sophisticated, I don't want to say cult, but a philosophy that takes spiritual life seriously, that introduces the scientific method to describing and measuring psychic phenomena. It was a dogma, or whatever you want to call it, a way of looking at the world, ready-made for Nelly, who had such great interest in the spiritual life anyway. And there was a man. Emil met him. I asked Emil, what was he like, this man? And Emil said he was a very ordinary man. I said, was there anything demonic about him? No, not at all. He was an ordinary man. And by agreement, this man and Nelly left very shortly after Wolf's birth to go to Berlin. And in Berlin, this is not clear at all what happened. It's not clear, but nobody really knows what happened. Anyhow, she became ill. She was in a sanatorium of some kind. Old Budger, Siegfried Budger, her father, visited her. He had suspected earlier that there was something wrong with Nelly, and he once consulted a psychiatrist, but nothing came of that. Anyhow, Nelly was put in a sanatorium, and there must have been a breakdown of some sort. My mother said about it, it is the first time in her life that she heard the word schizophrenia. And in the mid-30s, she died. Very young. She had suggested to Emil before she left, she said, the woman for you is Ellen Beck. I think once I leave, you should get together with Ellen Beck. Ellen Beck, B-E-C-K. And Ellen did that. And sometime after Nelly had arrived, and they had left, and there had been a divorce. He married Ellen Beck. And then Ellen Beck followed him to the United States, but that is not part of my story. My story is ending now, in 1935, when after Emil had been thrown out of the radio station where he was director of music at Radio Stuttgart. He had been working in Stuttgart more regularly for the radio station for 10 years, from 1925 to 1935. And in 1935, and here my story ends, because all the various strands come together, the strands of the story come together, he went to see Addie, the widow of Otto H. Kahn, who was the first cousin of his father. And there was Addie Kahn in a huge house on Fifth Avenue. And there was Emil, the refugee. This was the first important occasion, as far as I can tell, when a descendant of one firebrand, the Revolution of 1948, met a descendant of the other firebrand of the Revolution of 1948, or rather the widow of one. So Emil saw Addie Kahn, the Grand Dowager Queen of a palazzo on Fifth Avenue, and there was his poor refugee from Germany, poor relative. And it's not quite clear what happened. Anyhow, what is clear, and this is the end of my story, Addie was not a bit interested in him.